When talking about RPGs, mainly Japanese role-playing games, an excuse that I often hear is that it gets good 10 hours in, or 20 hours in, or sometimes even a game in when talking about something like the Trails series, for example. And this is an excuse that I used to hear for TV shows like The Office. When The Office was still airing, I watched the first 3 episodes and I said, this is boring, and I quit. And then, of course, later on, people go, no man, Season 1 of The Office is horrible. You need to start from Season 2 or 3, that's when it gets good. And okay, it's a sitcom, fair enough. I skipped the first season, am I really missing out on the storyline? Does it really matter? Is there even a storyline to pay attention to? Probably not. For a game, you can't skip the first season, skip the first game? Skip the first 20 hours? Can you just start a game and skip the tutorial? No. You need to power through it. And that's where my point comes, is that it doesn't work for games. When I play a game, it should be good the moment I press start. The setup for RPGs takes way too long. There shouldn't be a tutorial in every single RPG, especially for something. Let me just give you an example here, alright? With Final Fantasy XIII, the most classic excuse you'll hear is that it gets good 15-20 hours in when each character's jobs open up and you can have them be any role. But by that point, you've already played through, half the game? More than half the game? Why should I have to play 50% of the game that's boring before it finally opens up and becomes good? Why can't it be good right away? And Final Fantasy XIII, I hate to break it to you, really is not that complex of a battle system. You're only controlling one character at a time, and all you're doing is you're switching their roles around. Very rarely do you actually need to take the wheel and assign actions for your character. Most of the time, auto battle will pick the smartest decisions, and so it's a very streamlined game. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying it's a bad battle system, but doesn't need to take 15 hours before it finally takes off the training wheels and says, okay, go? Why can't it say go right away when I press start? Why do I need to have this protracted tutorial? Another example, Persona 5. Persona 5 has about 50 hours of really stellar content packed into about a 120-hour-long experience. So I hope you can understand where I'm coming from here, is that when I'm playing a 120-hour game, I'm not going to go, wow, 50 hours of that was amazing. I'm going to go, wow, 70 hours of that was filler. It was boring. And would I rather play a 120-hour-long game where 50 hours of it was enjoyable? Or would I rather play a 50-hour-long game where 50 hours of it was enjoyable? You see what I mean? It's like, percentage-wise, if I'm playing a game with good pacing, 100% of my time was spent having fun. Whereas if I play a longer game, maybe I'm having more hours of enjoyment out of it, but less percent of the time that I spent playing it was spent having fun. And this isn't an issue that's difficult to fix. Persona 5 suffers from a lot of the same issues that Final Fantasy XIII suffers from, mainly that the beginning is too slow. It spends way too long trying to get you acclimated to the various game mechanics and to the systems and trying to get you used to the world, and it takes about 12 hours before the tutorial is finally up and you can start playing the game without having your hand held. Did you need to hold my hand that much? So a genre that does this well is the character action game genre. I'll give you Ninja Gaiden 2 as an example here. In Ninja Gaiden 2, you're just dropped into a level and enemies attack you from all sides and it's sink or swim. You either figure this out real quick and fight these enemies off, or you die and you start all over. Okay, it's not an RPG. You could argue that it's not as complex as something like, say, The Last Remnant, where there's so much in this game that's completely obfuscated that you will never figure out unless you look it up. That's not the way that I want a game to be. I don't want all these systems to be hidden, but if you're gonna have a game that's relatively simple, like a turn-based game, you don't need to hold my hand for a dozen plus hours. Let me figure it out on my own. You don't need to tell me how to move around. You don't need to restrict a lot of the elements of the combat system until way later on. I don't view that as, okay, the combat system is evolving. I view that as me playing a very stripped down version in the beginning, and it doesn't really open up and become interesting until you hit that 10 or 20 hour mark. And 10 and 20 hours, that's a game. That's a full game. You could beat Parasite Eve in like 10 hours. You could beat the good East games like Ark of Nepishtim and Origin and Oath and Felghana. All of them in like under 10 hours, like 7 or 8 hours. 15, 20 hours, that's absurd. And that's why I drop a lot of modern RPGs that are 50 or 60 plus hours long is because of pacing issues. Pacing is something that's very difficult to discuss because it's not something that you can see or hear. You don't see a lot of reviewers talk about pacing because when you're trying to condense an experience into a 10 or 15 minute video, people want to be able to understand things that they can see. So it's easy to talk about graphics. You can see if the graphics are good or not. Music, you can hear if the music or if the voice acting is good. You can tell if the combat system is complex or if it's interesting or if it's flashy. If you look at a screenshot, you can tell a whole hell of a lot about the game. But what you can't tell from a screenshot or from even just, 20-30 minutes of footage is pacing. Pacing is something that you need to experience to understand. So let's explain it in a way that maybe makes a little bit more sense. Let's say you're trying to drive somewhere on vacation that's a couple hours away. Every time you have to take your foot off the throttle and hit the brakes, you're adding seconds or minutes to the drive time. You're adding in these interruptions, and over time they add up. So if I'm cruising through a game, I'm having a good time, and then it has to pull the brakes for me to do a fetch quest, or for me to have this long drawn out tutorial. You're stopping the progression, you're halting the action, you're ruining my momentum for something that's completely unnecessary. And yeah, it makes the game longer, doing these fetch quests, doing these side quests, and you can spend more time playing the game. Maybe you think you've got more value out of the experience because you've spent more time playing it. But when I look at it as less time spent having fun, doing the good part, and more time spent waiting at a red light. More time just waiting, wasting my time. It's some hurdle that I have to overcome before I can finally get the ball rolling again. And these seconds and minutes add up. Okay, maybe some games don't have long tutorials, so let me give you another example here. Brave Fencer Musashi. Like a lot of Square games from the PS1 era, it was very ambitious. It tried to introduce a lot of these unique mechanics to make the game stand out from the competition. But the way that these mechanics were incorporated is the issue here. Brave Fencer Musashi has this tired gauge, and so what happens is as you play the game, you're platforming, you're fighting enemies, this gauge will constantly fill up, and once it reaches a certain point, Musashi will start to slow down and he'll eventually pass out unless you manually make him fall asleep. And what happens is when you sleep, the gauge will slowly deplete and you get your energy back, and then you can finally leave the sleeping state and continue playing the game. But take a look at what this does to the overall experience. You need to stop doing whatever it is you're doing and watch Musashi sleep for several seconds before you can finally keep playing again. And is this interesting? Is this rewarding? Is this engaging? So much of your playthrough is spent just watching Musashi sleep because he's tired. Or here's another example, Final Fantasy XIV. I played Final Fantasy XIV when A Realm Reborn came out, and back then it took, like 120, 150 hours to complete that scenario? And the leveling experience is the reason why it took so long. Leveling in Final Fantasy XIV back in 2.0 was a horrible drag. You had to spend hours in these fate farming parties where you would join a bunch of other people and you would literally just sit and camp in one spot until a fate popped up, and then your whole group would rush that fate, complete it in like a minute or two, and then go back to your starting spot and just wait for the next one to pop up. And you would just do this for hours to gain like a level or 2 levels. And I get that this is an MMO, this is the nature of MMOs, but it's not really that fun. Maybe, okay, while I'm doing this, I'm talking with friends, I'm laughing, I'm cracking jokes, I'm having a good time. Maybe you have like a show on in the background to distract you, but as far as it being an engaging gameplay experience, it isn't. It's just very repetitive, it's very slow, and if I want to see where the story is going, I can't. I need to wait and proceed through all of this grinding before I can finally get back to the good part. And Square knew that this was an issue. I've heard that years later they went back and rebalanced the main scenario to either make you level up faster, or they probably pulled out a whole bunch of quests. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes like 30 hours to complete nowadays. But even now, there's another issue because there's a whole bunch of expansions, and if you want to play the latest expansions, all the ones that people are talking about and bragging how this is peak Final Fantasy and whatnot, you need to go through 2.0, A Realm Reborn, and all of the expansions afterward, and all of the in-between story between the expansions, and that takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours just to get, like, if you care about the story, you need to go through hundreds of hours to get to the part where it eventually gets good. Is that something that you're willing to do? That's a huge time commitment for something that's, you know, a story-driven game. It gets good hundreds of hours in, it gets good games in. This is also an excuse that I hear with the Trails of series, where I've heard people go, yeah man, Trails in the Sky 1, it's a little bit of a slow burn, but once you get to the second Trails in the Sky game, that's when it gets really good. That's the best game in the series. You know, a game gets good, a game in, and people will say, no, that's not true. Trails in the Sky 1 is good, but it's just slower paced. It's focusing more on the character interactions, but if you want something that is actually pertinent to progressing the overarching plot of the entire series, you get that with the second game. Well, why can't I get that with the first game as well? You know, who says you need to have this long build up for an entire dedicated game? Just have it be good right away. And I didn't even play the Sky Trilogy, I played Trails from Zero, but it's kind of the same thing where, okay, Trails from Azure, that's when it gets really awesome. Trails from Zero is a lot slower paced, and you need to just, you know, buckle up and get ready for that. Are you ready for 50 hours of very slow paced character development and doing all these activities where you're not sure what the hell the point of all this is? How do any of these storylines relate to one another? There's a payoff at the end of the game, but are you willing to play 30, 40 hours before you finally get to that payoff when I could be playing, you know, 5 or 6 games that are great all the way through from start to finish instead? And growing up, I played games with great pacing all the time because I had brothers and we played mostly multiplayer games on the Nintendo 64 and on the Super Nintendo. So we played fighters, racing games, beat 'em up, arcadey type games, which are almost entirely focused on having a consistently enjoyable gameplay experience from start to finish. They're shorter, they don't have a whole lot of wasted time with cutscenes, but you know, that's the nature of RPGs. But even RPGs back then weren't 100 hours long. If you look at Super Nintendo RPGs like Chrono Trigger, does it really take more than 20 hours to beat the game? And yet it's still to this day beloved as one of the best games ever made. And there's very little filler. Chrono Trigger focuses on keeping you entertained with new areas and new characters and new activities almost every hour. It's a game with great pacing. And even if an RPG isn't bogged down with endless hours of cutscenes, it can be bogged down with endless hours of grinding. I played Shin Megami Tensei V when it came out, and I stopped about 60 hours in because I didn't see the end anywhere in sight, and I had to spend so many hours grinding the same mob in the same area for hours and hours so I can get another level or two, so I can fuse the next demon that I would need so I can have a chance at fighting the next boss. You could argue that's the nature of the game. You either get it or you don't. If you don't find it enjoyable, why are you playing it? But there's a limit. You know, 60 hours in and I still need to grind so I can get the monster that I need so I can stand a chance at the next boss. It's very frustrating where every 5 hours you gotta hit the brakes and you need to grind some more. I don't really find that interesting. If you do that once, maybe twice, it's fine. But instead it feels like a game with maybe 30 or 40 hours of content and so much padding spent grinding that it inflates to like, what, 80 or 90 hours. It's so hard to find the motivation to replay these extremely long games just because I know that when I replay them, I'm gonna have to spend so much time bored. You know, watching characters just stand around talking at each other for hours on end and it's not progressing the plot. The character development on your first playthrough, okay, fine, you may find it interesting, but on a repeat playthrough, this isn't interesting anymore. I already know about these characters. I don't find the discussions between them that well written. I don't find it that engaging, and it's certainly not presented in a visually interesting way. So what happens is I get bored, and there's no way I would ever replay something like a Persona game. They're just way too long. Whereas I could replay, you know, Final Fantasy IV or Chrono Trigger again and again and again because they're brief, consolidated experiences that don't waste your time. There's not a whole lot of tutorials, there's not a whole lot of cutscenes weighing you down. There is optional stuff if you're interested in that, and you can make the game longer, but the point is that it's optional. If you want to have a game that's longer, the pacing will suffer from it, but if it's optional, that's fine. You can set the terms of the pacing to make it the way that you like. Maybe you don't want to have it on full blast the entire way through and just rush through the game. That's fine. That's the beauty of RPGs. You set the pace. You choose when and where and how long to spend on each activity. But when you force me to have a super long tutorial, when you have a game with 10 entries in the series and the first game is nothing but world building, when you have a 120-hour long game and you need to grind for half of it, there are plenty of people out there that love these slow burns, and there's nothing wrong with that. But try to view it from another perspective here. At the end of the day, when you sit down to play a game, any game, it doesn't matter, arcade game, shmup, racing game, multiplayer game, RPG, it doesn't matter. You're doing it as a form of entertainment. There are plenty of other things you could do to be entertained, but you're playing games because you want to have fun. Maybe some people will argue otherwise and say, no, I don't want to have fun, I just want to have a good story. In either case, you are being entertained. It's a form of entertainment. And there are plenty of games out there that have a better percentage of time spent entertaining you than others. I don't find games that have dragged out tutorials to be content that's engaging, especially if you want to replay it. That makes it even worse. And so when I view a game, I'm viewing it from the amount of time that I spend having fun in relation to the amount of time I spend not having fun. That's pacing. And considering there are countless games out there vying for your attention, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to waste your time playing games that get good 20 hours in, when you could be playing a game that's good and is 20 hours long.